Most men spend their entire lives reacting. Someone cuts them off in traffic, rage. Boss gives critical feedback, defensiveness. Partner says the wrong thing, shutdown or explosion. Jung called this being possessed by your complexes. You're not driving the car. You're just a passenger who thinks he's steering. The observer is not a personality trait, it's a psychological function you can develop. Carl Jung himself described a moment during a heated argument with Sigmund Freud where he noticed something strange. A part of him was watching the argument from a distance, almost clinically, while another part was emotionally engaged. He later wrote that this splitting of awareness was one of the most important discoveries of his inner life. He wasn't detached. He was doubled, present and watching simultaneously. Jung called this the transcendent function. When you activate the observer, you're not suppressing emotion, you're creating a gap between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, described the same phenomenon. He realized the Nazis could control everything about his physical existence but couldn't enter that inner space where he chose how to interpret his suffering. The observer is that space. It's not built through years of meditation retreats. It's built by catching yourself mid-reaction and simply naming what's happening. I'm triggered right now. That naming alone changes your neurochemistry. The shadow is what the observer sees first, and most men run from it. Consider Marcus Aurelius. He was the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, commanding armies, administering justice, holding the fates of millions. And yet his meditations, which were never meant to be published, they were his private journal, are filled with ruthless self-examination. He writes about his own irritability, his vanity, his fear of death. He doesn't perform virtue. He audits himself. That's shadow work without using the word. He saw the parts of himself that wanted glory, that enjoyed power, that feared insignificance, and he looked at them directly instead of projecting them onto his enemies. Jung argued that what you don't face in yourself, you meet as fate. The man who never acknowledges his own capacity for cruelty keeps finding cruel people in his life. The man who never examines his need for control keeps attracting chaotic situations. The observer doesn't judge the shadow, it sees it. And seeing it strips it of its autonomous power over you. You stop being puppeted by the parts of yourself you pretend don't exist. Silence is not emptiness, it's where the observer lives. Tolstoy wrote about a character in The Death of Ivan Ilyich who spends his final weeks dying and realizes, in horror, that his entire life had been a performance for other people. He'd never stopped long enough to ask what he actually wanted, believed, or feared. The silence he finally encounters on his deathbed is terrifying because he's never practiced it. Compare that to Schopenhauer, who argued that most human suffering comes from the inability to sit alone in a room, not doing, not consuming, not performing. Just being. The observer requires silence because it can't operate above the noise. When your mind is constantly stimulated, phone, news, arguments, plans, the reactive self is always in the driver's seat. Silence isn't the goal, it's the training environment. Even 10 minutes a day of genuine stillness, not guided audio, not journaling prompts, just sitting with what arises, begins to thicken the membrane between stimulus and response. You're not becoming passive. You're becoming the kind of man who chooses when to act instead of always being acted upon. The observer protects you from psychological inflation, the enemy of every man who starts winning. Nietzsche warned about this in a way that's often misread. People quote the will to power and think he was endorsing ego. He was diagnosing a trap. When a man starts achieving money, status, admiration, the ego inflates. He begins to identify with his role, his reputation, his success. And then when the inevitable failure comes, because it always does, he has no inner ground to stand on. He collapses because he built his identity on sand. Jung called this inflation, when the ego merges with an archetype and loses contact with the self. The observer is what keeps you from becoming your own hype. Every Stoic philosopher addressed this. Epictetus, who was literally a slave, said the only freedom is the freedom over your own judgments. Not your circumstances. Not your reputation. Your judgments. The observer is how you maintain that freedom even when external things are going well, especially then, because that's when the trap is most seductive. The man who can watch himself win without becoming his wins is far more dangerous and far more grounded than the man who needs constant victory to feel real. Developing the observer is the difference between living your life and watching it happen to you. Kierkegaard described 3 stages of existence: the aesthetic stage, chasing pleasure and novelty; the ethical stage, following rules and duties; and the religious stage, which he defined not as belief in God but as authentic individual commitment made in full awareness of uncertainty. You can't reach the 3rd stage without the observer. Without it, you stay in stage 1 reactive, appetite-driven, externally defined, or you lock into stage 2, performing virtue without actually living it. Camus made a similar point: the absurd hero isn't someone who has all the answers. It's someone who sees clearly, knows there are no guaranteed answers, and chooses to live fully anyway. That clarity is the observer's gift. When you develop the observer, you stop outsourcing your inner life. You stop needing circumstances to be a certain way before you feel okay. You stop being surprised by your own behavior. This doesn't make you cold, it makes you conscious. The difference is everything. A man who acts from consciousness isn't less emotional. He's emotional on purpose. He chooses when to be moved, when to hold ground, when to speak, and when to be silent. That kind of presence is magnetic because it's rare. 3 things to take with you. First, the observer is a skill, not a personality type. You build it by naming your reactions in real time, not analyzing them later, but catching them live. Second, the shadow is not your enemy. It's the unexamined parts of yourself running the show from backstage. The observer sees them, and seeing them is enough to loosen their grip. Third, silence is the training ground. Not as escape, not as spiritual performance, as a daily practice of creating the gap between what happens to you and what you do about it. Marcus Aurelius ran an empire from that gap. You can run your life from it. If this landed for you, subscribe. We drop one of these every Tuesday and Friday, no filler, no inspiration porn, just the kind of thinking that actually changes how you operate. Hit the bell if you want it in your feed when it goes live.